Today we're going to look at Oranges by Gary Soto, and we're going to use Preview on your MacBook Air or your MacBook Pro to annotate the text. So you'll notice here I have Oranges in a PDF, and to use Preview I'm going to do a two-finger click over the top of it. I'm going to go to Open With, and I'm going to use Preview. Notice that Adobe Reader is the default, but today we're going to use Preview. Oranges by Gary Soto appears. Make it a little bit bigger. Today we're going to highlight as we go through this text, and we're going to highlight what the author says, what the narrator says about himself, as opposed to what the narrator says about the other character in the poem. And in this case, it's a girl. So with Preview, we have a number of tools. If I go, I know I'm in Preview because it's next to the apple. If we click on Tools and we go down to Annotate, you can see all these tools we could use: highlighting text, underlining, strike through. We could put shapes. We could actually even add text boxes or add speech bubbles or thought bubbles. Today we're only going to highlight text. So this is one way to get to the tools. Another way to get to the tools is this button right here. So when I click on this button, notice that I get a series of the same tools, but I get icons in the status bar that represent those tools. This is the button right here that we'll be using, and this is the highlight button. And if I click on the down arrow, notice I have a yellow, a green, blue, pink, purple. I can also get to underline and strike through here. Today we're going to start with just using the blue. With the highlighter, we're going to read through Oranges by Gary Soto, and we're going to focus on where the narrator talks about himself. The first time I walked with a girl, I was 12. So the first time I walked, if I click and drag, notice that I get a blue highlighter. I was 12. He was cold and weighted down with 2 oranges in his jacket. Notice that frost was cracking beneath his steps, his breath before him gone as I walked toward. So everything in blue is where the narrator is talking about himself. I'm going to scoot down a little, and here's where he continues to talk about himself. A dog barked at me. I smiled. He's talking about himself. A little further down as I read. I turned to the candies, tiered like bleachers. He's talking about himself. I fingered a nickel in my pocket. I didn't say anything. I took the nickel from my pocket, then an orange, and set them quietly on the counter. When I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine. And held them, knowing very well what it was all about. I took my girl's hand in mine for 2 blocks, then released it. I peeled my orange. I was making fire in my hands. So everything that's in blue is where the author has been talking about himself. Notice on the left-hand side under highlights and notes, everything that I highlighted, I get to see what the actual text is. So if I wanted to, I could look over here and I could determine if all of these items were about the author talking about himself. To make sure that that highlights and notes pane is active, I have to have the View menu open, and I have to have highlights and notes checked. So now let's switch to the perspective of where the narrator talks about the girl. So I'm going to click on the down arrow. I'm going to select pink as my highlighter. And the first part where we hear about her, it's her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow night and day in any weather. The girl, she came out, pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. the girl. As he smiled, he touched her shoulder and led her down the street. Here's another part about the girl. Light in her eyes, a smile starting at the corners of her mouth. And she lifted a chocolate that cost a dime. Back up to the top. Her unwrapped the chocolate. This is about the girl. So at this point now, within the highlights and notes, I have items that I've highlighted that are the narrator talking about himself, and items I've highlighted where the narrator is talking about the girl. I'm going to do one last thing. I don't have to do this, but I think it'd be useful. I'm going to switch my highlighter to green. And there are a few spots I've noticed in this poem, Oranges by Gary Soto, where he talks about both of them. For example, until we were breathing before a drugstore, we entered the tiny bell, bringing a saleslady down a narrow aisle of goods. So this is where the narrator is talking about himself as well as the girl. In the next column, outside, a few cars hissing past, coats between the trees. That was the brightest, the gray. So this really seems to be, to me, the only place in which he has talked about himself and the girl at the same time. If you read the poem, Oranges by Gary Soto, you might come to a different conclusion. But now if I look at the poem, I can really understand my thinking about where the narrator talks about himself, where the narrator talks about the girl, and where the narrator talks about himself and the girl at the same time.